Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this 16th edition of the EuroCommerce Policy Talks. Today, we have the pleasure of talking and interviewing Anna Cavazzini. Anna Cavazzini is the chairperson for the Internal Market Committee in the European Parliament. And our exchange this morning will focus on how retailers and wholesalers can support Europe's sustainability objectives, but also what are the expectations from policymakers. We have today over 300 registered participants, so welcome everybody to this very interesting policy talk. As a short introduction, I would like to reiterate that our sector understands the sustainability imperative and supports the goals of the green transition. Retailers and wholesalers on emissions are quite limited, 5 to 10% of total greenhouse gases. However, together with their supply chains, they represent no less than 40% of total emissions. Retailers and wholesalers are also uniquely positioned to nudge their customers towards more sustainable choice. A number of leading retailers and wholesalers have already made very ambitious commitments towards net zero, but our sector is also made up of many other businesses, especially very small, who may lack the capacity and the resources to abide to the same ambition, and they need specific support. Consumers are challenging us, and our businesses need to adapt. Demand for more sustainable product and assortment is increasing. A new generation is focusing on product use as opposed to ownership. Second-hand, repair shops, refurbishments are emerging as new models. Much remains to be done to help these markets develop. We need common standards, we need to facilitate data exchange, we also need the infrastructure, for example, for the collection of waste for circularity objectives. But this will not happen without a change in the consumer mindsets. A recent study by our Swedish members indicates that so far 41% of consumers in Sweden still preferred buying a new product in case of a default. At a time when businesses are facing real difficulties handling a challenging environment, dialogue with regulators is extremely important. Many companies still have not recovered from COVID, and they're now facing a very difficult environment resulting from the impact of the war in Ukraine, disrupted supply chains, higher cost of energy, inflation, and important as well, depressed consumer purchasing power. The transition will require major investments, and our sector cannot do this alone. It will also be important in such a challenging environment to ensure that legislation is based on existing business practice and creates the least possible costs on operators. Dialogue with regulators and with consumers will be again fundamental through this journey. On this note, Mrs. Cavazzini, I'd like to welcome you, and we look forward to hearing your views about how the Parliament can help through this transition, but how also you see our sector's role in the transition. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction and also for giving me the chance to be present at your event and answer all your questions, discuss with you, and also, of course, get new ideas from also your side, because policymaking, as you know, is not a one-way street. It's not that we as policymakers get the ideas out of the sky and try to regulate, but of course we are also very much dependent on input from the stakeholders, like your sector, which is indeed a very important one, as you mentioned at the beginning. I see it at the moment we are very at a crossroads of internal market and also consumer policy. I think for the last 30 years, we focused very much on harmonizing the internal market rules and also really integrating the EU internal market. And that was, of course, very important. As you know, we will celebrate very soon 30 years of the EU internal market. But of course, now we noticed with the Green New Deal, with the climate crisis, that also the internal market rules need to be adapted in order to better reflect sustainability needs. And that is what we are doing at the moment. We have very important legislation going on, but I think we will discuss a little bit later in detail. But of course, the main two big, I would say, narratives are to make all products on the single market sustainable per default. And there's, of course, a lot of different pieces of legislations linked to that. And secondly, also look at the supply chain. So look at all the products that come basically from outside of the European Union into the single market and make sure that also our supply chains are sustainable and that we don't just outsource CO2 production or any other environmental degradation to other countries. And I think these two main narratives are leading our work on the sustainable single market at the moment in our committee, of course, very much connected with the role of consumers, because you mentioned at the beginning, of course, also consumers play a crucial role in all of that. Probably a last comment from my side for the general introductions before we go to the detailed questions. I think when you look back to the last 2 years, two main lessons can be drawn from the role of the internal market in the European Union ecosystem, environmental and also, of course, economical ecosystem. First of all, the internal market can really play a role as the Commission calls this life jacket, but I completely agree with that. We have interrupted supply chains, we had the pandemic, we have now the Russian aggression, and of course it is very, very important that within the European Union we have uninterrupted supply chains, we have a strong internal market, but we also saw it's not taken for granted. With the pandemic, all of a sudden we had like border controls back, we had like huge queues of trucks at the border. And that is why, next to this whole question of how we can transform the single market and how we can adapt the internal market rules to reflect more the sustainability needs, to also make sure that in times of crises, the internal market does still basically flow and can still fulfill its function. And that's why we're also very much looking forward to the Commission proposal on a single market emergency instrument that will hopefully better reflect all the problems we saw during the pandemic, but of course will also reflect the supply chain problems we see at the moment. So yeah, with this broader introduction, I'm very much looking forward to the debate and to the more detailed questions on the single piece of legislation that we're at the moment negotiating. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cavazzini. So a number of important points that you have highlighted, and certainly that resonate with us is the importance of the single market and the importance of the single market, in particular in the current in our current environment. The single market is the biggest instrument and the strongest tool to help us manage the current situation. So it is a fundamental value that we uphold as a sector. For the second part of the policy talk, we have collected a number of questions from the audience, and Ilya Bugerman, our Director for Internal Market and Consumer Policy, will take us through some of those questions and look to make this as an interactive discussion. Ilya?
Yes, hello. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Ms. Cavazzini. Thank you for being here. And yeah, indeed, I think your introduction was already very interesting, and you already touched upon more issues, I think, only than sustainability, which also obviously are also of interest to us. But maybe a question to start with, because there are many different initiatives now linked to sustainability, also in the Parliament, and even still, on their way. And how do you, as chair of the IMCO committee, do you think you can ensure alignment and coherence between all these different legal proposals?
Yeah, that is of course a very good question. We had already in the past interesting challenges. For example, the Digital Single Market Act came first, and then another file that was linked, for example, product safety came after. So I think for us in the European Parliament, it is basically daily business, as it is for the Commission, I can imagine, to make sure that these different pieces of legislation are combined and don't contradict each other. I think the main idea for us is always that there is basically umbrella legislations that is more horizontal, that is more general, but when it comes to more specific items, we have more like basically sector-specific legislation, and this is how we try to increase coherence between the different legislations. There is, of course, a challenge when the timeline is not completely equal, but I think for the sake of consumers, for the sake of businesses and the citizens in the European Union, it's very important to really ensure the highest level of coherence between the different files, and we definitely try that. Probably we don't always succeed, but we tried.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah. I think from our side, obviously, there are always concerns about this. Also, sometimes even coherence with already existing pieces of legislation that are already there for a long time. And I think a recent example is, for instance, the proposal on empowering consumers for the green transition, and actually the still upcoming substantiating green claims proposal, which is not out. And at least in our view, there is a direct link. And then we see that there are lots of definitions actually in that legal initiative that has been published. But it's really unclear what those mean. And the answer we expect would be in the next one. But it also makes it very difficult for us to really have sometimes a very strong or detailed position on these issues. But I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. And actually, I have another more general question. And this is a bit linked to the right to repair. And I know that's close to your heart because I recall that I think you were a big supporter of the resolution on right to repair from earlier this year. And I think for us, we are retailers and wholesalers. So consumers buy products from us, but we don't produce them. But consumers, they come to us when something, when there's a defect. And obviously you have the legal guarantee, but obviously what's possible outside of legal guarantee. And I think in this context, we really support the creation of a culture of repair and reuse. We see that really as something that is necessary to create a real sustainable single market. Because if consumers do not opt for repair, and if it's not interesting for industry to offer this, I mean, you can probably invent all the legislation that you want, but it will not help. So, and I think in this sense, so how could we make the right to repair, I think the most economically feasible, sustainable, and attractive option to consumers and to retailers? But because we are convinced that if we make the right to repair interesting for retailers to offer, or producers, they will offer it to consumers, and consumers will choose that option. But how do we get there? And I think in a positive way, not only in the regulatory framework.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. I think it's, of course, really great and important that also EuroCommerce is supporting the right to repair as a very important stakeholder in the internal market. As you are probably aware, that also the big majority in the European Parliament is supporting the right to repair. The resolution that you mentioned that came from my committee was adopted, I think, with only 5 or so votes against and some abstentions. So really the big majority of the Parliament is supporting it and is really also putting pressure on the Commission to finally come up with a proposal. And this has to do with the fact that indeed it is something that European citizens want. You see it in a lot of polls, but you also see it in practice where in a lot of different cities all over Europe, repair shops and repair cafes emerge, and there's much more demand by consumers to repair their products, or also complaints of why products only last 2 years and then they break. And I think it is also a very empowering idea, because it connects the producers but also the consumers, and gives the consumers a lot of power, and also right to repair, to get involved in the whole production cycle. And I think that makes the proposal very interesting. As you mentioned, it has to be a basket of different measures. There cannot be one piece of legislation that is then the right to repair, because you have so many different angles where you have to start, and so many little tools you have to screw in order to get the right to repair at the end. For example, one very important dimension is the consumers and the better information to consumers, and that why is, for example, in our resolution in the European Parliament that we voted, we asked for a repair score, for really very clear information on the products to the consumer, so that they know, is this product repairable or not, to facilitate also the choice of more sustainable products at the end, but also having better access to information for individuals, but also repair shops, for example. So one important dimension is the consumer part, and I think it has to also go hand in hand with other more soft law measures, like, for example, better education in schools, or better probably also advertising or even campaigning for the right to repair, what it is. And then you have basically the classical product policy, and that probably come later to it, but with the proposal of the Sustainable Product Initiative, and this whole idea of having already basically circular economy or repairability by design. And then, you have the third dimension indeed of the legal guarantee of where do you have the spare parts, who repairs this at the end, how much does it cost. And this also, I think, has to be really taken into account and has to be included in a strong right to repair. We also in our resolution demand exactly that, a longer extension basically of the legal guarantee, but also the notion or the demand that producers have to keep the spare parts available for longer time, and that repairs must not be more expensive than buying a new product, because this is of course the absurdity at the moment, that sometimes it's much more cheaper to buy a new product, let's say a toaster or a kettle or whatever, than letting it being repaired. And there's also some interesting initiatives on member states level. This is, for example, nothing the EU can do, but for example, in some states in Germany, I'm a German MEP, the government offers a kind of repair bonus. So if consumers repair their product, they get a discount on the repair bill, and that should also incentivize consumers to repair their product instead of basically buying a new one. And last point, sorry that I was a little bit long, but indeed the right to repair is really very close to my heart. The last and interesting point, and this is probably a question back to you. Often I hear from citizens when I talk about the right to repair, okay, but at the end, I don't know, shops want to make money. And of course, if you sell less products, or companies want to make money if you sell less products, how does this work at the end? Is it also a business model for example, retail shops or wholesale shops? Because at the end, the idea would be you probably sell less products. But I would say, okay, if it's better quality products, it is of course also a viable business model for companies. But this is probably a question back to you, or a discussion point that I have.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good question. But maybe just replying to your answer, I think it sounds really interesting, all the ideas and suggestions you list. And maybe first to say, I think we fully support extension of the Eco Design Directive, so as part of Sustainable Products Initiative, because we see this as the best way forward. If you make products sustainable by design, obviously it becomes easier for consumers to make the right choice, even though they might not realize that, obviously. So we really support that part. And I think if we look at information to consumers, I think there we have a bit of, well, it's not really maybe a concern, but there is already a lot of information on products. And what we see, and I think actually also the European Consumer Organization, BEUC, agrees with us in this one, there's some kind of consumer overload, right? You have so much information, and how much information can a consumer absorb when they want to buy a product? And probably still the most important piece of information is the price tag. How much does it cost? So how can we make sure that information is meaningful? And I think at the same time, just making things more transparent, just providing more information might not necessarily lead to more sustainable choices. Maybe there's something more that needs to happen. And then I like this example from Germany, actually, that you mentioned, because we heard a similar example from our Austrian members, where people get a 50% discount with some kind of repair voucher. So this is an incentive for consumers. And I think this is really one of the way forward. So what kind of financial incentives can we give to consumers, but also to businesses to offer repair? And I think there we come to your question, because if you there's always a cost for a repair. Somebody has to look at it, somebody has to repair it. So even that's without even the cost of the repair itself, you have to pay the person. So you will always have this minimum threshold. Maybe it depends a bit on which country you are, but let's say, I don't know, this is just, an educated guess, 50 euros. So if you have a repair that is below 50 euros, it will always cost you more to repair than to buy a new one. But at the same time, you could also say, well, but repair is still the more sustainable choice, right? So how do you make that choice the most attractive one? And I think in this sense, maybe there are, financial incentives via taxation or whatever that can be given to businesses that want to offer repair, which could be retailers, could be wholesalers. And I think the moment also when you allow businesses to make a profit, because I think that was one of the questions also, I think the Commission asked in their public consultation, should it be for free for consumers? Should it be for the cost price? Or should there be some kind of profit allowed? I mean, if you don't allow profit, if we need to offer it for free, I mean, there's no real incentive besides the legal obligation, right, to offer such a repair. So this was, I think, that at the start of my question. So how we need to think about positive incentives for both sides, because if we do that, consumers will want to repair their product and businesses will want to offer it. So when a consumer comes, in the store, the retailer will say, wouldn't you prefer repair? Because it's a profitable option for the retailer. So how do we do that? And I may not have all the answers at this stage, but I think it would be very good to take that into account, I think, in the upcoming discussions on your file. But maybe that also leads to another question, and that's about also how can we keep sustainable products affordable, because we see a lot of pressure on prices these days, energy prices, inflation, and at the same time, every time when we need a new piece of legislation requirement, it adds a little cost. In most cases, it's usually not a simplification. So how can we make sure that products remain affordable for consumers? Have you discussed that? Have you thought about that?
Thank you so much. Before I answer this last question, probably some short remarks on what you said before. On the consumer overload, I absolutely think the information has to be concise and clear. And I see basically two different pieces of information on products. So one, if you take the digital product passport, that is also already in the Commission proposal that we as IMCO committee also want. you have already at the end, I guess, then a really super detailed QR code that you scan, and this is really for professionals or for consumers who really want to go in details, or for, I don't know, civil society who wants to make comparisons whatsoever. And then you have like a simple repair score. So that's why I also think it's important to have different pieces of information on the product. One is like super simple, that the consumer can immediately have a red flag or like a green flag or whatever and see. And the other one is for other businesses, for consumers who want to go into details and so on and so on. And that would be the product passport. And at the end, I think with the digitalization, you would also make it a little bit more easier handleable and so on. Then I think what you said about the positive incentives, I mean, I could not agree more. I think in general, we are now living in the world where we still, I mean, one example is fossil fuel subsidies. We often tend to make it easier for policies that are harmful, while we punish the more sustainable choices. And of course, it has to be the other way around. And I think one thing you need to look at is the tax system. Of course, there is not really partially EU competence, but it's more to the member states. But of course, you could say you have different VIT categories for repaired products or repairable products than for others, and so on and so on. You have the repair bonus. But I also absolutely agree, at the end, it needs to be the more attractive choice also financially. And that brings me to your question. Of course, we have at the moment really a very bad time for consumers with the exploding prices, and for some of the consumers it doesn't, they probably don't notice it because they have enough money, but especially for, I don't know, 1/3 of, or what is it, 40% of the people in Europe who are really having difficulties in getting on with their living, cost of living, there is of course a problem. But nevertheless, I want to clarify that a lot of issues at the end that is related to regulation or to price increases for sustainability are not making the biggest part of the cake or of the price diagram, I would say. For example, there's calculations, if you pay the minimum wage in Bangladesh to a textile workers, then the t-shirt gets like, I don't know, 20% more expensive or something for a t-shirt that you can buy at Primark for €3. So I think we have to be also super clear what are really the price increases coming from regulation and what is coming from really external factors, like at the moment the gas prices or the supply chains interruptions and so on and so on. And of course, as a green, I have to say the prices, at least before the inflation, were also not saying the truth, because we were just outsourcing a lot of the impacts to the global south, to the environment. So we have to be really careful how to deal with it. At the end, I think part of the answer is, of course, also a better social policy that is, of course, also at member state level, but making sure that people can also just live from their salary, and they will still have a problem, especially also, for example, in Germany, where I come from, where we still have a huge part of society living off the minimum wage.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's it's a very nice transition to the next question, which is in relation to the global competition, and how do we ensure that our companies in Europe, abiding to these new standards, remain competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We're not operating in a bubble in Europe, and many of our members actually recognize the values that are being upheld. However, a couple of remarks. One, the cost of compliance. As a sector, we come at the end of diverse, multiple supply chains, and we tend to bear a lot of the cost of compliance, and the cumulative cost of compliance is important. Hence the importance for any legislation to be based on existing business practice. I mean, we talked about the Sustainable Product Initiative. We partnered with GS1, which is a standard body on common principles. And if the legislation was able to capture and reflect those standards, that would make the exchange of information much, much easier than having to focus on different sets of compliance requirements. So here is an invitation to look at what is out there and build on what is there to seek to reduce the cost of compliance. The second point is in relation to enforcement, risks of unfair competition. We said European businesses will have to comply with those higher standards, but they're still facing competition from operators outside Europe. So how do we make sure that we have enforcement and that we have some or perhaps seek some form of global alignment on those standards? One has also to think that many of the global chains are operating globally, and therefore could also have to apply standards according to where they operate. So not just in Europe, but also elsewhere. So what are your views on those issues?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think it is indeed super important to look at the global dimension. And yeah, as I said at the beginning, I think the idea that a lot of stakeholders at the European Union are pursuing at the moment, including in the European Parliament, is indeed looking at the supply chains, making them more sustainable. And of course, with sustainability here, I mean also making them greener, less CO2, and so on, but also making them more resilient. And of course, I guess this at the end is also in the interest of businesses to not face again the risk of interrupted supply chains and so on. How can we really make sure that our supply chains are also stable and resilient in the future? And I think both goes a little bit hand in hand at the end. So a lot of the legislation, I mean, all the legislation, obviously, that we are discussing and also hopefully voting soon in the European Parliament on, for example, circular economy, will also apply to imports. So this is the basic thing. And of course, with that, I think we make sure that European companies, let's put it like this, are acting on the same footing, on a level playing field with producers from outside of the European Union. I think that is, of course, very, very important. For me, what I discover a lot when I talk to stakeholders about the problems with that idea is that sometimes market surveillance authorities in the past years were not equipped more or in a better way with all the new tasks. And I think this is probably something we have to work on, that we make sure that at the end the rules are really enforced, and that indeed also products that are coming from outside of the European Union really also live up to the standards that we are developing here. I think, or I can imagine that it is also that we will also see in the field of circular economy, of sustainable products, the typical Brussels effect. I mean, we see it already now with the DSA and the DMA. Will big American platforms really develop two different standards for coping with the EU legislation and then having their own standards for the American market? I don't know. Probably at the end they will also align. And this I can imagine also in the field of sustainability, that probably a lot of producers at the end on global level would probably also more align with these standards. It's of course not a given, but I think we saw it in other fields that this happened. The Commission is also already in a lot of international circular economy diplomacy or talks with other countries, for example, with China. I mean, of course, this is more like a soft power instrument again, but I think it's important to really see how also other producer countries are really aligned with these circular economy standards. And probably last but not least, I think what you said at the beginning is absolutely true. I think no one of us, and I think with all the way how it is set up, the Sustainable Product Initiative wants to reinvent the wheel. Of course, it has to be based on existing business practices. It has to be take into account the experience that the businesses have, and also standards that had been already developed. Or, of course, we are at the moment also strengthening the standardization organizations so that they really come up with workable and uniform standards.
Ilya, you need to unmute.
Sorry. And I have maybe a question following on this, and because I think that there's obviously one important aspect here. We represent retail and wholesale, so we are the reseller of the products produced by others, and in some cases we have own brands, retailer brands, but there actually we ask others to produce them and package them under our name, basically. But it also means we are dependent on the producers, for getting the correct information about, because we haven't made that product. So we can check whether all the right information is, or if the information is there, but we cannot check if the information is correct, because that's something we don't have. And I think throughout different proposals, we see that in some cases there is a certain burden being placed on the retail sector, which actually is very difficult. So I think, for instance, well, it's not in all cases, it's problematic, but let's say if we look at Empower Consumer proposal, we see there are, information obligations at the point of sale. So that's us, but you need to get that information from the producer. But I think it's still not super clear in the proposal, but more or less. But I understood there is also this issue if we look at the deforestation proposal, where actually there might be an obligation on retailers to also to check whether the information is correct. And how do you see that in this context? Because it is very difficult for our sector to have that information, but also maybe we can connect it to the wider question, maybe more in general. What do you see as our role? We are between the producer and the consumer, but obviously for the consumer, we are often the first port of call when there is an issue, when there is a problem, when they want to have information. So how do you look at that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it is really interesting to look at the deforestation proposal indeed, because I think, for example, supermarkets, retail, wholesale, and so on plays a huge role. I really remember when 1 year ago, I believe, in Brazil, the huge forest fires in the Amazon started. And basically, the right-wing president Bolsonaro even, I don't know, I think blamed NGOs that they put the fire, whatever, didn't do anything in order to fight it. And yeah, all of us were like, okay, wow, at the moment, the biggest biosphere of the world is just collapsing. I had talks with a lot of big supermarket chains in Europe, and given the fact that already some, for example, Tesco and so on, was very early in saying, okay, we don't want to have, in that case, if Bolsonaro is not doing anything, have Brazilian beef in our supermarkets. And the discussions I had with a lot of the supermarkets was very interesting. And I learned that, for example, already most of them, or a lot of them, were by themselves starting to look in their supply chains and said, okay, we don't want to fuel deforestation in the Amazon with our products. How can we, as a retail sector, contribute to the fact that that our meat or our whatever soy we are, okay, there's not really soy in supermarkets, but you know what I mean, indirectly, is not contributing to global deforestation. And here again, I think a regulation at the end will create a level playing field and will help those that are already at the forefront and that themselves already have decided that they need to take action. I think at the end, will absolutely benefit, especially those who are at the forefront. When it comes to your question, indeed, the Commission proposal foresees that big traders are basically defined as operators, and the Commission, as you probably know, is of the opinion that based on the experience with the timber regulation, where there were a lot of loopholes where, I don't know, products entered via one member state and then at the end and were on the EU market, but then at the end didn't basically fulfill the standards or were coming from deforested or were deforested, that they wanted to include an additional check. And of course, you can tell me more if you think this really creates really practical problems that you don't get the information. But I think the idea is very smart to give big traders a bigger role in the supply chains, because I guess anyhow big retailers have interest in getting an overview of their supply chain, knowing where it comes from, and also probably even using it as a marketing issue at the end. For example, I have supermarkets where I always go that I trust, because I think, okay, this supermarket is more sustainable and has better quality products. And I think you can also really use it as a marketing issue at the end. But going back to the discussion, we had also in my committee discussions, or we're still having discussions on the big trader as operator versus not idea. But I personally believe it is the right thing by the Commission to propose that, because like this, we really close all the loopholes that we saw with the timber regulation.
All right, thank you. Well, I think it just shows that a lot of our members are already taking a lot of initiatives, also asking their suppliers to ensure products are sustainable. But I think the point here is more like how far can you go for a sector that doesn't make those products or might not even have a presence there. So it will be very difficult in those cases. But maybe a last question is about something else. It actually is about green claims. So how can we ensure effective enforcement, and how can we ensure a level playing field, and not only in Europe but also with third countries? Because I think what we see also another piece of legislation, that then there are new obligations for companies based in the EU, which in principle also apply to third country traders selling to EU consumers. But then, how do we enforce the rules over those companies, which is very problematic? So have you thought about this issue, or have you discussed it with your colleagues? Like, what can we do to improve enforcement so that we ensure that everybody active in the internal market respects the rules, and we don't create, we don't increase the cost for EU-based businesses and just make the gap wider between, compliant products and the ones that sell non-compliant products outside the EU and that don't care anyways. They're not going to even make an attempt to be compliant.
Yeah. No, as I mentioned at the beginning, or in some of the questions already, I think enforcement is really crucial, not only for having really the security for consumers that the standards are met, but also really for creating a level playing field and not having disadvantages for companies who really stick to the rules and others who don't. I see two big angles for that. One is basically strengthen customs. We are also doing that in the Internal Market Committee. We just 2 weeks ago finished the trialogue on the single window for customs. The customs policy is always a little bit technical, and I think not so many people are interested in it. But at the end, it's really, really important that we strengthen our customs, because this is also where they do the controls, where they make really sure that all the products who come on the single market are not basically undermining our standards. And the second issue is market surveillance. And this is, I mentioned, and I really see indeed a challenge and a problem. It's still basically also member states' competence, but I think at the end we need to make sure that the different market surveillance authorities are better equipped and better aligned with the new challenges. But I'm very, very open, of course, to also hear your proposals on all of the questions, but also exactly on this one. If you see other tools, other avenues than those two that I just mentioned, you can also, in the aftermath of this discussion, write me again, contact me, and also, of course, give me your ideas on the different pieces of legislation, but also on this question, obviously.
Right. Thank you for that. I want to be mindful of time, and I know you're very busy, so it's 11:30, and we will definitely follow up with you. But I don't know, Christelle, if you maybe want to say a few final words, or.
Yes, thank you. I would like, on behalf of our audience and our members, I would like to thank you very much for the exchange today, and stressing again the importance of dialogue. We heard today the importance of the sustainability imperative and the role that our sector plays within that. We also had this exchange on how the importance of regulators in supporting the effort, creating incentives for consumers to invest and to change their mindset, but also in creating the standards and the level playing field so that everybody can compete on the same ground, and also in facilitating investment in sustainability. What is also important for us is the importance to recognize the role that we play as a sector, as retailers and wholesalers, but also the limits. We are not producers; we are sellers in the first place. As well as the diversity in our sector, we heard about the many good practices of the front runners, but also the importance of taking into account that our sector is also made up of a wide diversity of much smaller businesses that will have to follow suit and will need help in the sustainability transition. So on these notes, I wanted to thank you very much, Mrs. Cavazzini, for this very open dialogue. And we look forward, as Ilya said, we look forward to continuing this dialogue with you and the Parliament on those issues. Thank you very much, everybody. And we look forward to the next edition of the Policy Talks.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.